Thank you, Professor Cottini. Thank you for inviting me back here, this place. I thought I had been here some 10 years ago. I was told that the archives show that I was here in 1979. I can't quite believe that time goes so fast. It's a great honor to be in this intellectually vital. I've been so impressed by meeting Professor Cottini and others that I will mention. Yeah, they know who they are. Thank you. So, what is Dante's Europe? Throughout Paradiso, Dante makes several references to Europe, more overtly to Rome's providential status within salvation history. The references to Europe, its origins, its limits, its cultural legacy, its role in the world, appear only in Paradise. Europe does not figure in any other place of the poem. One reference appears in Paradiso 27, and this is the context, very briefly, so you know what I'll be talking about. The pilgrim stands at the frontier of the physical universe, and Beatrice, who is guiding him, asks him to lower his eyes and look back at the distance he has traveled. As he gazes at the arc of space along which he has turned, he sees in the west the pillars of Hercules crossed by Ulysses. And in the east, the shore Europa walked when she was swept away by Jupiter. The mythological coordinates, the two coordinates, Ulysses and Europa, throw into relief Dante's understanding of Europe, its geographic delimitations, and its symbolic history. The myths of Ulysses and Europa complement each other. Ulysses' quest for knowledge, a kind of philosophical discovery, comes through as a tragic transgression of the pillars of Hercules. He searches new worlds, sails past the frontiers of the new world, and flounders. On the other hand, the passion of Jupiter for the maiden Europa, while he disguised himself as a bull, as you remember from Ovid's story, projects love as violence. Dante rehashes, in other words, Ovid's myth. Europa, who comes out of Asia, Europe comes out of Asia, is carried to Crete, that's the myth, on the back of the bull god. From her line descend both the labyrinth and the city of Thebes, a city which has a tragic fratricidal history. And both come through as the underside of Europe's culture. If Ulysses' story stands for the heroic madness of the European mind, the labyrinth in Crete, the labyrinth in Crete, on the other hand, and together they represent the epitome of philosophical knowledge, as if this were a defining quality of Europe, a rational philosophical knowledge. The tangle of erotic violence, the flight of the mind to escape the maze, the labyrinth, and the fable of the Minotaur, the half-man, half-beast of death. The symbolic spiritual geography of Europe has other extensions in Paradiso. In Canto 6, where Dante highlights one of the legacies of Europe, that is to say, Paradiso 6, the other trait of Europe is law, the Roman law. If the other stories are stories of transgressions, they are prefigured by a focus on law, Paradiso 6. This is the canto of the Emperor Justinian, who is celebrated for the code of Roman laws and the collection of extracts, the so-called Corpus Juris Civilis, and as well as the opinions by Ulpians, Papinianus, etc. And it opens with a reference, Canto 6 of Paradiso, with a reference to the eagle of the empire, nested nello stremo d'Europa, in this extreme point of Europe, Canto 6, line 5, at the periphery of Europe, or Constantinople. The reference is that Europe's unique, universalizing, juridical identity as the house of Roman legal traditions. A third occurrence of the name of the word, the term Europe, is found in Paradiso 12, where the life of Saint Dominic is told by a Franciscan, Saint Bonaventure, in reference to his birthplace in Castile, near the western coast of Europe. Dante says, in quella parte ove surge ad aprire zefiro dolce le novelle fronde, di che si vede Europa rivestire. In that region where the sweet zephyr rises to open the new leaves, with Europe sees herself reclad. A distinct, unique, and universalizing theological message rises with Dominic from the West. The militant Christianity of the Dominicans that will move eastward. Why would Dante limit to paradise the references to Europe? The answer, for now, tentative, preliminary, is simple. In Paradise, Dante, is engaged in the reconstruction of the whole world, or in the reconstruction of the earth. So, the idea of a definite, distinguishable identity of Europe, made of mythical origins defining its philosophy, Ulysses, its violent history, Europa's rape, and the construction of the labyrinth, its Roman laws, and its medieval theological message with Dominic, all reflect, first of all, Dante's awareness of the conception of the world as 12th century. That's to give you a little bit of history. 12th century and 13th century cartographers and encyclopedists represented. The idea of Europe as a distinct geographical, historical entity originates actually in the court of Charlemagne, and it remained set apart from the encroaching armies at the time of Islam. It can be said that Islam helps define Europe's cultural distinctness. According to Guillaume de Conches and Vincent of Beauvais and Brunetto Latini in the Tresor, who inherit the lore of the Greek and Latin geographers, Strabo, Pliny, and Solinus, the so-called orbis terrarum, the orb of the earth, is divided into three parts. This is the historical information about Europe. There are three continents at the time: Asia, Europe, and Europe appears as an appendix of Asia, and Africa. Three, only three. They knew nothing, of course, of us here. Because the scientific subdivision of the world into the three continents agrees with the biblical narrative of the three children of Noah, Sem, Asia, Cam, Africa, and Japheth, Europe, the patristic reflections, above all St. Augustine and Orosius and Isidore of Seville, retread the same scientific tripartite structure in the world that Dante inherits, accepts this configuration that Dante inherits. In this sense, Rome is in Europe, and yet it will appear to be larger than Europe. In Monarchia 2, just to give you added information what Dante really knows about Europe, Monarchia Book 2, a philosophical, which is, those of you who do not know yet, a philosophical political tract that argues for the providentiality of the Roman Empire in the wake of the Aeneid, Dante recalls that among Aeneas' ancestors there could be found Asian kings. He also recalls that the fathers of Troy, among the fathers of Troy, the European Dardanus descended from Electra, daughter of an African king, Atlas. And Dante also underlines that Aeneas' three wives He had 3 wives, according to the Aeneid. The Asian Creusa, who dies, disappears during the fire that destroys Troy. The African Dido, who is a wife, would say common law wife, he marries her in a cave. And the European Lavinia, so there are 3, one Asian, one African, one European, recapitulate the history of the 3 continents, then known. In point of fact, Dante, following Virgil, insinuates a drastic distinction then between Europe and Rome. In giving witness to the universality of Aeneas' mission and his 3 wives, one from each different continent, and prefiguring the unique universality of Rome, he casts Europe as distinct and yet as part of a larger, transcendent whole. Accordingly, in Paradiso 6, the genealogy of the Roman Empire is said to derive from the marriage of Aeneas and Lavinia. In short, Europe and Rome exist in Dante's imagination as distinct, separate, and yet complementary entities. The ideology of Romanitas, in effect, grounds and shapes the claims of Europe. The relation between Rome and Europe, thus, can be called a difference between a part and a whole. Why this relation? To what end? The pages that follow intend to explain the reasons and implications of such a distinction and complementarity. I would like to turn to exemplify Dante's awareness of Europe now, more textual, more specific, to the heaven of Jupiter. As you know, paradise is arranged according to a number of planets. Jupiter is the middle one, Paradiso 18, 20. And Dante, as some of you may know, connects each planet with each of the liberal arts. Grammar for the moon, music, etc. The heaven of Jupiter is the heaven of geometry, and focuses on the question of justice. That's what they're talking about. In Jupiter, there's geometry and justice across the 3 continents of the earth. Dante ponders, in other words, one of the most perplexing moral theological questions in the poem. The relation between Europe and the parts of the world from the point of view of the spiritual salvation of individual human beings. That's here in the heaven of Jupiter. He starts doing this. What is the salvation of individuals and individual human beings? What is the context? He has just watched what amounts to a theatrical performance. The souls of those who administered justice on earth dance, dispose themselves in a circle, and arrange themselves in vowels and consonants, which by sort of visible speech spell out a verse from the book of wisdom. Diligite justitiam, qui judicatis terram. Paradiso 18, line 91. Love justice, you who judge the whole earth. Comes biblical commandment. Souls here are symbols, a means of divine speech. Subsequently, the lights of this phrase and this line, the lights of the blessed descend and perch on the letter M, terram, of the word terram, by painterly metamorphosis. The M turns into a lily, and the lily into the eagle of Roman justice. Over the next canto, 19, as the eagle who appropriately voices the universal claims of Rome, reflects on the inscrutable designs of divine justice. It raises a key question for the understanding of the Christian economy of redemption and what do we mean by a Christian justice. And for the sake of time, I skip the Italian this time. This is the English text that a man is born on the banks of the Indus. We are in Asia. And none is there to speak or read or write of Christ. And all his wishes and acts are good, so far as human reason goes and sees. Without sin in life or in speech, he dies unbaptized and without faith. Where is this justice which condemns him? Where is his sin if he does not believe and was never given a chance to know of Christ? Quite clearly, here, the very heart of the heaven of Jupiter, the passage evokes a moral but non-European and non-Christian world of the Hindus. It localizes a different cultural world. It says here, man is born here, etc., which is the reality of the context. In the context means there, and distinguishes between a Christian West and a non-Christian East, as if there, between Europe and Asia, as if they were also here and here were there. More substantively, its burden rests on what could be called, and I don't want to be too complicated here for the sake of the young minds, but listen, it's very simple, the idea. We call it a Pelagian principle. Pelagius was a British monk who believed that if you do well in this world, you are saved. That's all, that ethical living would be perfect for salvation. This principle, which Dante puts forth obliquely in this canto, in the form of a question, asserts the irrational moral conduct and discourse, even if carried outside the guidance of and faith in Christian revelation, may or ought to suffice for salvation. This argument about shared, universal moral precepts in both the West and the East assumes the existence of a natural law, accessible and common to pagans in what used to be the Greek-Roman world, pagan world, such as, and in fact, the Asian Raphaeus, the Roman Cato, Trajan, as well as Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Hindus. Dante has a clear awareness of a geographical, theological alterity of the Hindus and pagans in relation to the European Christian revelation. This awareness is not a novelty at this point in the poem, because in the first canto of Purgatorio, I just alluded to it, Dante raises the question of the salvation of pagans, and throughout Purgatorio, Cato, Trajan, Raphaeus, within the Christian economy. So these pagans represent, this is now what we can say about the Roman and Greek pagans and the people who live outside of the Christian revelation in Europe. These pagans represent in relation to the Christian a difference in the order of time. Now we have those who are in order of space, they live outside a certain place. In Roman times, they're different in the order of time. The Hindus represent a difference in the order of space. They embody the persistence of a geographical and spiritual universe, which is external and parallel to the Western theological tradition. The poem, as is known, also chronicles the alterity of the Muslims in relation to the Christians throughout. We are being told about this. But the difference comes through a somewhat different from the sense of otherness of the Hindus, because the opposition between Muslims and Christians rises on the same biblical terrain, and it is marked by rivalry and violence. Dante has been alluding to the Crusades in these very cantos. The memory of the Crusades plainly, steadily punctuates the narrative of the Divine Comedy. In these very cantos in the heaven of Jupiter, we read of the enmity between Muslims and Christians, who are figured, the Christians by Charlemagne, Roland, Godfrey of Bouillon, who was the famous captain of the Crusades. The relation is marked not by reciprocal violence alone. Dante does not hesitate to include among the Muslims Averroes, the great philosophers, Avicenna, and the Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, and that as true models of chivalry in the list of virtuous pagans, alongside Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, etc. This is an Inferno, of course. To capture, however, Dante's precise sense of the theological difference of the Hindus in relation to Christian Europe, we must go back to the canto in the heaven of Jupiter and to its narrative context. Let me talk a little bit about Paradiso 17, 18, and 19. The pilgrim has moved from the heaven of Mars, where he had met his ancestor, Cacciaguida, and where the two of them have gone over the chronicles of ancient Florentine history. Later, in Canto 18, Dante commemorates the heroic virtues of biblical figures, Joshua, Judas, Maccabeus, figures, that is, from the Carolingian epic cycles, Charlemagne and Roland, who died at the Battle of Roncesvalles against the Muslims, and of the Crusaders such as Godfrey of Bouillon and Robert Guiscardo. With the recall of the tragic rivalries in the Christian camp and the no less tragic hubris of Roland, remember the story of Roland, who refuses to blow the bugle to call Charlemagne to his help, Cacciaguida vanishes from the scene. In other words, the defeat of Europe, of Christian Europe, is the consequence of the hubris within the heroic members of that party. No sooner has Dante entered the heaven of Jupiter that he sees a spectacle. The theatrical sequence of the souls that I have been alluding to, arranged into a linguistic citation, metamorphosed into a lily and into the Roman eagle. Diligite justitiam judicatis sternum. On the letter M, there is a transformation of the letter becomes the lily and in turn an eagle. And then to the question, where is this justice that condemns the Hindus? Dante answers. Dante has a very precise answer. He answers that the human mind cannot grasp the depths of divine justice. Just as the eye, he says, when one stands close to the shore, sees the bottom of the sea, yet the eye cannot see the bottom when one goes further inside, further out. And to stress the point that a purely formal profession of Christian belief cannot be thought of as sufficient to reach salvation, Dante evokes, at this point, the history of contemporary Christian Europe's violence and moral decay. So we do have the great principles of justice. That can be somewhat explained. And now Dante turns to the reality of Europe. And let me tell you what he says, paraphrasing the text. That he gazes at European history and evokes, it's amazing, where did he get the information? I don't know. And evokes the corruption of Albert, the Holy Roman Emperor, the sorrowful action of Philip IV, Philip the Fair, Filippo il Bello, as it is known, King of France, the battles between the English and the Scots under Robert Bruce. He says, there shall be seen the pride that quickens thirst, which makes the Scot and the Englishman mad, so that neither can keep within his own bounds. He mentions the lascivious role of Ferdinand IV of Spain and Wenceslaus, king of Bohemia, la lussuria e il viver molle di quel di Spagna e quel di Boheme. The errors of Charles II of Anjou and Frederick II of Aragon, king of Sicily. The corruption of the king of Norway, Portugal, Serbia, Navarre, Cyprus and Hungary, etc. in the space of about 50 lines. European history, the reality of European history then comes forth as morally dismal. Clearly, difference, the idea of difference between the Christian Europe and the non-Christian other, cannot be understood to refer only to a world outside of Europe, because it stands at its very heart. We are different from where we ought to be in Europe. I mean, I'm talking as if I were a European. As if Europe's inner moral identity were flawed, and it's not univocal. Nevertheless, Europe is delineated as the privileged space history of the poet's moral concerns. Dante's sense of the heart of the matter now emerges. And the question is, how this Europe he has just been mentioning, this corruption all over, how does it manage to communicate to other different cultures? What is it going to tell them? And what does it have to say? What does it have to say to them? These questions figure prominently in the Divine Comedy, and they are raised through a distinct theological optics. Two textual examples about this theology. First of all, the life of St. Francis in Paradiso 11, and which is told by the Dominican Aquinas through a reference to non-European, non-Christian spatial coordinates. Dante there is aware that the three continents of the world come together with a message of Dominic, and now he's earlier the canto Francis. So he's interrogating, is it possible for this visionary Francis to talk to the whole world? It's not part of the corruption. There's something outside of the corruption of Europe. Francis is linked to both Asia and Africa. First of all, as you know, the birthplace is Assisi, is evoked as if it meant Orient, by pun on words, Ascesius, the Assisi Orient. More than that, Francis is called a sun, a sole, a sun, rising at the Ganges in the east. Later in the hagiography, Francis is described as he travels to Egypt, Africa, where he preaches unsuccessfully to the Sultan. In an oblique way, Dante acknowledges the historic role of the Franciscans migrating and witnessing all over the non-Christian world and connecting it to the European orbit. This cultural geography is reenacted in the life, as I've been implying throughout, in the life of St. Dominic, as told by Bonaventure, who tells us, by overt symmetry, that he was born at the western frontier of Europe, Paradiso 12. The geographical references to these two messengers, as Dante calls them, the messi, messengers, Francis and Dominic, messengers of Christ, suggest a crucial question hovering over the religious orders that they founded: whether and how the Christian message can reach ever the cultures of Asia and Africa. Or to say in a slightly different terms, where exactly a European perspective, what is the European perspective on the world, is located within a global context. That's the issue. What is the European context, the European perspective? So that's what I'll be really talking about for the next 10 minutes. As Dante raises these issues textually, he no doubt keeps in mind one of the richest and most polemical works written in the 13th century, which is the Conferences on the Hexameron that St. Bonaventure compiled and delivered at the University of Paris during the Lenten season of 1273. In the 6th of the 23 lectures, Bonaventure draws a theological map of the world, or more precisely, he focuses on three distinct theologies of history. One of them, which would be associated with the name of the Arab, a Muslim, Averroes, who is Aristotle's commentator, and whom Bonaventure identifies with, Islamic theology, posits an impassable distance between man and God. There's nothing, there's no way of connecting the two. The second theology of history, which Bonaventure identifies with Neoplatonic philosophical illumination, and the third age of Joachim of Flores' vision of history, asserts the diffusion or total immanence of God in history. And this is, it's a theology of history associated by Bonaventure with Hinduism. So he talks about two, Hindus and the Arabs. One posits the great distance between God and man. The other one, a kind of, we would call it sort of pantheistic, the Hinduism. God is everywhere, in everything. As mediating between these two theologies that radically contradict and exclude each other, clearly, Bonaventure places Christian theology. The reason he gives for this assumption is clear. According to this theology, God is neither completely immanent in history, nor is he absolutely transcendent and out of reach. The mystery of the incarnation, according to which God is simultaneously immanent and transcendent, connects and reconciles the polarization of the other two theologies. Dante, then, understands the constitution of Europe as a distinct entity. I'm giving you some kind of recapitulations as I proceed in order to go somewhere else. As a distinct entity or a unique perspective by virtue of its universalizing Roman laws, its universalizing rational philosophy, whereby all men and women share in the order of rationality. From this standpoint, Dante belongs to the dominant philosophical tradition of the 12th and 13th century, the so-called Neoplatonists of Chartres and the Neo-Aristotelians of Paris and Padua, who proclaim the universality of philosophy and reason. They do so by theorizing as Averroes does, the Arab Averroes does, on the unity of the possible intellect. And they do so by promoting, as Aquinas does, the circulation of ideas of St. Augustine, Boethius, Maimonides, the Averroists, Cicero, etc. By such a procedure, he realizes an ideal of culture aimed at dissolving sectarian rigidities. The whole idea is that culture can circulate, allow the circulation of ideas, and we lose sight, and hopefully, of sectarian rigidity. But I have also been arguing that alongside these unifying trends, Dante is aware of Europe's own boundaries and geographical mythical differences, theological, legal, and philosophical. So there are specific qualities of Europe in relation to other worlds. Other worlds exceed and lie beyond the space of Europe. And these other worlds, identified with the lands of the Hindus and of the Muslims, confirm, strangely enough, they confirm Europe's identity and mark its limit. the alterity of these other worlds is not definable as if they simply lay outside of Europe. Europe paradoxically appears different in relation to itself. You remember there's a lot of corruption within Europe. In the sense that its moral political crisis or religious dissidence appears within its own body. To understand how these different worlds, which are organized by their own peculiar perspectives, each world, Asia, the world of Africa, the world of Asia, the world of Europe, is organized by its own peculiarity, how can communicate with one another, it's necessary to go back to the cantos in the heaven of Jupiter to probe their deeper conceptual concerns. Dante represents his sense of the problematical relations existing between Europe and its own heterogeneity, Europe in relation to the whole earth, and the links between philosophy and theology. I mean, can philosophy help us to communicate? Is theology only that which separates us? But Dante thinks about it through the optics of geometry, which, as you remember, I said it's really that science that rules in the planet of Jupiter. And let me show you what he thinks of what geometry is. E lo cielo di Giove si può comparare alla geometria per due proprietà. The heaven of Jupiter may be compared to geometry because of two properties. One is that it moves between two heavens that are antithetical to its fine temperament, namely that of Mars and of Saturn. Consequently, Ptolemy says in the book referred to that Jupiter is a star of temperate constitution between the cold of Saturn and the heat of Mars. The other is that among all the stars it appears white, almost silvery. And now he goes on with the properties of geometry. What is geometry really? What does it mean? All these things are found in the science of geometry. Geometry moves between two things antithetical to it, namely the point and the circle. And I mean by circle in the broad sense of anything round, whether a solid body or a surface, for as Euclid says, the point is its beginning. And as he says, the circle is its most perfect figure, which must therefore be conceived as its end. Therefore, geometry moves between the point and the circle, is between the beginning and the end. Geometry establishes relations, connects points apart from each other. As between the beginning and the end. And these two are antithetical to its certainty. For the point cannot be measured because of its indivisibility. And it is impossible to square the circle perfectly because of its arc. And so it cannot be measured exactly. Geometry also is most white insofar as it is without a taint of error, and most certain both in itself and its handmaids, because it's in that which is called perspective. Dante is interested, that's my argument, in geometry, because geometry is the science of perspective. And I have to explain in a while what we mean by perspective. What is a perspective? The passage from Convivio, the philosophical text, is rooted in the traditional association of the liberal arts with the planets, whereby each of the liberal arts is assigned a specific role in the philosophical education of the soul, which is really what Paradiso is, the philosophical and, of course, theological and moral education of the soul. The moral virtue linked to the planet Jupiter is temperance. It moderates between the Saturn and the fiery Mars. I'm paraphrasing the text. Beginning and end. Although Dante makes no claim that geometry can be considered the model of any other science, is it the model for politics? Is it the model for theology, for ethics? He doesn't say that. He acknowledges its flawless scientific foundation. It is a science insofar it is defined by its own principles and not by external criteria. These attributes of geometry, where does Dante get them from, in case there are some historians about you here, were available to Dante from the cosmological epics of Bernard Sylvester, who was associated with the school of Chartres, Alain de Lille, and Martianus Capella, etc. In this tradition that I mentioned here, Jupiter holds together the cosmos by harmonizing opposed destructive forces. Now, Dante's text, though, also identifies the science of perspective as geometry's handmaid. Now I'm going to explain what perspective is. The word comes from the Latin perspicere, which means to look closely, and denotes the so-called natural perspective of medieval optics. This techne aims at studying the mechanics and principles of the phenomena of refraction, reflection, and directed vision. That's one meaning of perspective. It examines the how and why of the apparent diminution or enlargements of objects when seen from near or afar. This science originates among Arab investigations of the natural world from practice and experiential concerns with issues of light, sight, properties of the eyes, and nature of light. In line with Aristotle, it was viewed by Averroes and Albert the Great as a more physical than a mathematical science, and it became a hinge between geometry and astronomy. For now, however, let me stress how Dante's inclusion of perspective within the orbit of geometry echoes the medieval encyclopedic tradition of Hugh of St. Victor, who says, geometry holds the fourth immobile magnitude like the earth. Geometry means earth measure, for this discipline was first discovered by the Egyptians, etc. The lexicon of both geometry and perspective figures centrally in the heaven of Jupiter. Let me give you some examples. The pilgrim's passage from Mars to Jupiter is described as his consciousness that by circling round the heavens had increased its arc, etc. The primary aim of geometry is knowledge of the whole cosmos. Its foundation of the cosmos occurs by the work of God as a geometer who constructs the world as a circle and draws its boundaries with compass and ruler. And this is Dante's text now. He that turned his compass round the limit of the world, and within it marked out so much both hidden and revealed, could not so imprint his power on all the universe that his word should not remain in infinite excess. And this is certified by that first proud one, Lucifer, who was the highest of all creatures, and who, though not awaiting for light, fell unripe, from which it is plain that every lesser nature is too scant a vessel for that good which has no limit and measure, and measures itself by itself. Thus your vision, which must needs be one of the rays of the mind with which all things are replete, cannot of its own nature be of such power that it should not perceive its origins to be far beyond all that is apparent to it. The image of the compass that you captured in this passage, the tool of God's construction of the universe, links geometry and justice. And by that link, Dante retrieves the Platonic Pythagorean image of God, the geometer, who literally encompasses the intelligible order of the whole creation. The figure of the compass, furthermore, implies the interdependence of a fixed point and a circle. That's what a compass does, center and circumference. The symbolic conjunction of theology and geometry, on the other hand, rests on two biblical texts. One is Job, where he complains about the injustice inflicted on him. And I quote from Proverbs, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined the measurement or stretched the line upon it?" This is Job, I'm sorry. The other is Proverbs. "When he established the heavens," meaning God, "I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to sea a limit so that the waters might not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master builder, and I was doing his delight, rejoicing before him always." Like Job, who bends over the limits of the human and perceives the distance between the unfathomable justice of God and the human understanding of justice, Dante stresses the incommensurability between divine wisdom and human knowledge. The bottom of the sea, as you remember, he says, remains invisible to the human eye. If the construction of the world amounts to its circumscription by the geometry of God, God's infinite excess escapes all boundedness. The two words, infinite and excess, describe a going beyond boundaries and an infinite magnitude. Thus, although Dante ponders the destiny of the Hindus, elevating human reason and philosophical knowledge to a criterion of salvation for all, now he perceives reason's limitations as an organ of knowledge and transcendence. Neither justice nor man's salvation, he concludes, are reducible to the measure of rational discourse. Dante's argument then seems to have reached a dead point. He has confuted the paradoxical nature of philosophy, its simultaneous power and weakness, and he has stared at the contradictions and divisiveness of theology. But his thought, however, does not rest in an insoluble quandary. As I pointed out at the beginning of this paper, the souls are involved, and I come to the conclusion, are involved in a play or dance. They swirl, fluttering, they arrange themselves in a circle and spell out a verse from the Book of Wisdom. You remember, Diligite Justitiam, qui judicatis terram. As a series of metamorphoses ending in a lily and eagle unfold, the scene figures a pictorial representation with its chromatism. While its chromatism is all described with red of sparks, the silver of the planet, the white of the lily, the gold of the verse, stresses the painterly figure. On the M of the word terram, the lily changes into a Roman eagle. The scene has been understood as an allegory of justice. Like the flowers that appear on the face of the earth, justice blooms spontaneously in the order instituted by the empire. This view is correct, and yet it does not explain the implications of the artifact, which I try to do now and conclude. Dante goes out of his way to mention that the artifice of this optical phenomenon is God himself. He says, he who there paints has none to guide him, but he himself does guide. This motif of the Deus Pictor, God, the painter, which complements the earlier motif of God, the Geometer, connects geometry and painting, gathering sparks of souls to make words, and announces the poetic structure of the world, whereby, in the language of Psalm 114, the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. From this standpoint, the pictorial representation is not a mere digression. It dramatizes the presence of a choreography to admonish us to observe and love justice. Why does Dante believe that justice, to be loved, needs the beauty of art? One answer is that justice must be loved as art and beauty are loved. And the value of this assertion depends on Dante's insight that an ethical perspective must be yoked to an aesthetic perspective. The good, beauty, and art are man's true home. Another answer is that justice is made comprehensible by virtue of art and its self-transformative nature. More than that, justice cannot be constructed with the rigor, can be constructed with the rigor reserved to art. Finally, the imaginative conjunction between art and justice illustrates an aspect of geometry which is called the artificial perspective. It is usually believed that the Middle Ages focuses on natural perspective, question of optics, lenses, etc., and ignores the artificial perspective, the perspective of art, which is a way of using perspective for the geometric construction of space. The reason for this entrenched opinion is clear. The artificial perspective, which inaugurates a new conceptual paradigm of space, is thought to belong to the invention of the Quattrocento painting. In the space of appearances, perspectival paintings draw, the emphasis falls on the centrality and singularity of the subject or spectator's viewpoint. By contrast, the Middle Ages practices an art, so we are told, tied to a shared worldview as well as to a belief in the objective criterion of vision. Dante is aware, however, that perspective which celebrates individuality ends up in a sort of narcissism. Narcissus foretells the myth of a young man who is taken by the self-reflection that he sees in the mirror of nature. Two passages, so beginning with the question of what perspective is, but there is a sense of the limit of perspective. Two passages in the cantos encapsulate the critique of perspective from the viewpoint of infinity. The first refers to the unfathomable quality of eternal justice, whose depth is concealed to the human eye just as the bottom of the high sea is concealed. The other, stemming from the particular query about a justice that damns one born on the bank of the Indus, where he has never heard of Christ, also focuses on the limitation of perspective. And Dante, the response is this: now who are you who would sit upon the seat to judge, as 1,000 miles away with a short sight that carries but a span? A span. The word spanna, span, a term that defines the extension. This is a span, a spanna of a human gaze, belongs to the lexicon of geometry. It designates the hand measure and denotes the distance between the end of the thumb and the end of the little finger in a spread hand. The term signals the myopia of human judgments and perspectives. It is compared to the sea of justice, which is boundlessness and defies the very possibility of perspective. It is at this point of the text that the image of the eagle, to admonish us about the dangers hovering over moral provincialism or cultural narcissism, goes over the crisis of European history. One broad, geometrical, spiritual question Dante has pondered in this cantos about justice is: how do we measure? What is a place? What is the Hindus? What is Europe? What is Africa? What is here? And isn't there really here? Is there a place where justice is to be found? That's the question. And above all, which is the place of truth to which one accedes? By raising these questions to the science of geometry, the poet does not leave us in a vicious circle. Rather, around this question, he does something unique. He has opened up a dialogue, different perspectives, and that opens up a dialogue. And he has established a new relation between philosophy and theology, Christian Europe and other continents, us and them. He turns around the secular debates on the relation between theology and philosophy, which the Averroists solved through the formula of the double truth, the truth of reason and the truth of faith. Already, Aquinas had warned that theology must contain philosophy, and Aquinas does so in a double sense. Theology must proceed theologically as it sounds the context of faith. At the same time, it must bring to completion the limits of philosophy, which coincides with the limits of human reason. The conceptual premise for these intuitions articulated in the planet of Jupiter lies in the pilgrim's encounter with his ancestor, Cacciaguida, in the preceding heaven of Mars. The intimacy of their encounter, which unfolds through a tone of familiarity and affection, hinges on the memory of Florence and becomes the basis for the pilgrim's global perspective. The two aspects, Florentine localism and Christian universality, implicate each other. The conversation on their native city, families, histories, dates, is crossed by some textual references that push our attention outside the narrow circle of the city walls. Cacciaguida greets his great-grandson with the pietas that echoes the meeting between Anchises and Aeneas in the Elysian fields. Si pia l'ombra d'Anchise si porse, se fede merta nostra maggior musa, quando in Eriso del figlio s'accorse. With like affection did the shade of Anchises stretch forward, if our greatest muse merits belief, when in the Elysium he perceived his sons. The principle of joining together universality and contingent history, which spans, grounds, and transcends the articulation of European civilization, involves all the time the whole of mankind. In the wake of Roman and Christian universality, Dante's gaze looks up, and his poetry, which is the very voice of Western spirituality, lays bare the rootedness of every familiar and subjective perspective in the vast latitude of the earth. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have some time for questions. As a first reaction in front of this lecture, and as a scholar of the 19th and 20th century, not a scholar, I found particularly interesting the naming of some concepts that appear in Dante that actually refer to some of the dialogues that are happening in Europe, at least a few of them, as an initial reaction, an initial start of a conversation. first, the gap between a territorial or geographical Europe and the perception of an identity of Europe. Is Europe just a territory, or does it have an identity? The second, the relationship of Europe with an otherness, an alterity, and the kind of option between reading this otherness as a threat or as an occasion to acquire awareness of Europe's cultural distinctness. Think of the relationship between Europe and the Muslim world in the present. Third, the role of culture in allowing people with different backgrounds to communicate, to bind people together. And the option that he presented, which was very interesting to me, about the role of geometry as kind of an individualistic geometry, which ends up in narcissist position, or geometry as a model for culture in se. So a place where points are intimately related, each point is related to another point, the culture of relatedness. And how culture is the place where different voices can start to actually communicate and find this identity. Actually, Europe is looking for, not only at Dante's time, but also now. Just list these chapters that are still open nowadays, and I thank you for highlighting them. I'm not listing them all because it was so rich what you were saying. Thank you for presenting them through the eyes of Dante, the eyes of a man who lived like 7 centuries ago, 750 years ago, to be precise, but that allows us to read the present through, to give us categories to read the present. So this is actually what culture is. It's not just like a museum of things that are happening in the past, but a way to enter in the present with an hypothesis coming from a tradition. This said, I just wanted to leave the floor open to any possible question or comment on this lecture. So, I don't think
could I add one thing? It was a beautiful synthesis
go ahead.
that you gave, and and I largely agree with what you said. But there's another issue to the relation, the dialogue that can be constructed. And it can be constructed, first of all, you do need two perspectives in order to open up a dialogue. That's the argument. But the other implication, which is really more implied than stated, you can never really give up your perspective. Because if you do, there is no dialogue. Absolutely. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's really the argument, which is extraordinarily subtle. And the other is that the perspective of the infinite that Dante has, that sort of upsets, disrupts the notion of the geometry, which is that which is measurable by definition. So there's an infinite which exceeds the finiteness of our perceptions.
A different measure.
Yeah.
Oh, Camila.
Right now in Germany there are so many protests going on, and most of the cards, like the signs that I see, the phrase that sticks out is always "no to the Islamization of Europe," as if there are two things that are exclusive to one another. Is that what you're referring to? That there's a sense that, in this case, by Islam coming to Europe, you will be losing some of that European heritage, that you can't join them?
No, I wasn't really thinking of that. My answer would be, well, what Dante, you're really more interested in what Dante says than what I think. The hope. The question in Dante is that what seems to be the weakness of Europe has nothing to do with the perspective from the outside. The weakness of Europe, let's say the Christian West, let's call it in a way that is more intelligible, but the question of Europe has to do with its own internal weakness. It's the exemplified by the great hero of the Christian world, Roland, who has to fight. He's fighting the Muslim invasion of Europe, and he could beat them. He only has to call for help. Charlemagne is waiting for him to call. Says, if you're at risk, call us. We come and we give you a hand, and you win. And there it is. This is why the story of Roland kept fascinating the consciousness of Europe throughout the Renaissance. Even if the Italians went on making fun of it through the Orlando Furioso, Pulci, etc., and Boiardo, they retrieve of this in a kind of comical mode. But the fascination is real. It's the great hero of the Christian West turns out to be his own worst enemy. He lacks the kind of things I would say, humility. I need help. I'm not the big hero all the time. This is a time when I'm being overwhelmed, and he would have needed that kind of, and he doesn't do it. So the implication is, do not believe that if there is going to be a great critical new reality emerging in Europe, do not go on just blaming others. Look at yourselves. Nobody can really beat you if you're up to the task. And then Dante goes on recalling at the very point about, what is the Hindu saved? That, takes a very noble view about the other. Can he be saved too? And what are we to say? That of course he can be saved. Of course. But the whole question is, let us look at Europe. And when you look at Europe, he says, and you look at Europe from Russia to Portugal, from Sicily to Scotland, etc., this is a corrupt world. What do you care about if it's saved or not? Saved from what? It's already lost. Do you see the logic of the whole argument? So the call is on our own responsibilities. We want to save. I speak as a European, we want to save Europe. Let us live then according to the criteria whereby that salvation is possible. That's the argument that if I knew anybody in Germany, that's what I would tell the Germans, rather than just parading this, frankly, at times a little bit revolting idea of Hitler and so on. This is crazy. I don't want to have anything to do with that kind of vision and self-understanding. That's the way they understand themselves? No. Why don't they just do what is proper? And nobody can touch them. Nobody. If they do. You had your hand up, man.
Follow up to this one. So you talked about kind of like self-reflecting on its own weaknesses and like Roland, but at the same time, Europe is also a place from where people go, right? It's like a place of explorers, of people who leave and go. And so you mentioned one of these examples, St. Francis and the missionaries, but also thinking about what you said at the beginning about how Dante's, how the boundaries of Europe are made on the one side from the Colonna d'Ercole, the Pillar of Hercules, so like a moment of transgression. And then one would think about Ulysses, right, who's in the Inferno.
Good.
So I guess
I'm so glad that you followed all of this. I thought that this is just my, my nightmares. I'm a poor sleeper, so I write these things at night. But it's clear. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about like this. We have two examples, right? We have two examples of people who leave, but for two very different reasons and with different outcomes. So if you could comment upon, I guess, Dante's view on the impulse of European to leave and to go and to do what?
Very good. That's where I began. There is on the one hand the noble, the great hero Ulysses. But if you look at Dante's representation of Ulysses, there is an ethical transgression right there. He turns out to be a poor king, a worse husband, a terrible father, because he wants the gratuitous knowledge, which is this is really the great Western impulse, to know more, to reach beyond, etc. And there all the time. And that's tragic, because it amounts to a view of philosophical knowledge as self-assertion and really, let's call it imperial fantasies. On the other hand, we have indeed Francis and Dominic. And the question there is, these are people who, the two messengers from whom emanate these new messages. Can they reach the world outside? And Francis fails. And yet he has conquered in his very failure, especially him. Because he goes to the Sultan, he did not go there with arms. He went there in a peaceful way, gave him the lesson, they welcomed him. He says, no, we're not. But you see, it's already a different world that he has, very different from the world of Ulysses. And then there is the whole idea of violence that is running through. So Dante is very careful. The world of art, for him, because he's speaking as a poet, the world of art, the world of justice understood even as something achievable through the rigor of art, through the idea that the beauty of it all. This is really something that is very unique. So there are four qualities that Dante acknowledges for the uniqueness of the European discourse. The universality of laws. Of course, the Romans have been transgressing them left and right. I mean, it was a lawless region of the world, right? A band of lawless people. But there is a universality of reason that cannot really be pushed to the level of being absolute, though it has also counterparts within, for instance, Averroes and the Arab world. There is the message of the specifically Christian message of Francis and Dominic, and there is also Dante's own contribution, the aesthetics, the aesthetic vision of the world. So there are four things. Some of these things work, some of them do not work, but this is really what constitutes the uniqueness of the West. And I'm not sure that I don't agree with them. I think that if I look around, since Luca, if I may, Luca is worried about the extension of these insights into today's world. The horror of invasions of cultures that end up in the destruction of artifacts. I don't think that I'm not an aesthete at all, but it horrifies me, the idea that works of art, the iconoclasm is such that it destroys everything that generations that preceded us have shaped and preserved. But for Dante, this becomes a genuine problem. Okay, this is the way in which a distinction is being established, and that distinction is crucial for any possible dialogue. No easy, as the Italians say, volemo bene, no, let's get along. No, that's too easy. You have to hold on to what your criteria are.
So I think it's wonderful to focus on the person in the script, right? And a very important thing to share with the audience that someone like Dante would have had such knowledge and would have been pondering such a person.
Excuse me, I have to stop. Why? Why do you make that statement? Someone like Dante would do that?
Because I think that there are first-year students in this audience who wouldn't necessarily know that Dante knew about the Indus Revolution.
Well,
So I think it's
that's what I call narcissism.
Sorry?
That's what I call narcissism, the belief that we know better. You see what I'm saying? I'm not challenging you. I'm just the idea that we know, but Dante wouldn't. That's our narcissism. You know, we know better than the people.
What I wanted to ask you is, you talked about Bonaventure's 22 lectures, right, at the University of Paris?
Yes.
And I think another thing that might be interesting to share with first-year students is how a layperson like Dante would have been familiar with those lectures if you're connecting those two dots. So
Thank you. That is a great question. The second part is really a great question. What is true knowledge? That's it. What is true knowledge? Philosophy in and of itself is useful, but it must always be shown both in its limitations and how it really needed supplementing by theology. Dante understands that. I think the uniqueness, that's his uniqueness as a poet, not to see an intrinsic break, a rupture between the so-called secular arts and, on the other hand, theology. It's part of a continuous discourse, a thread that stretches on for the personal, the social, the intersubjective, and so on are all here, the political, are all connected. And the ways in which we come to understand that exactly through the exercises of all of this, the knowledge, the study of all of these traditions, the theological, the philosophical, the aesthetic, the political, etc.
I have a question, and maybe I didn't understand all the connections. So, is Dante really saying that the fact that Europe exists is because of the Christian faith, or because, you know, in the European Union, one of the issues is why we are all together. And there was a certain thinking, I would say 3, 4, 5 years ago, to put, or maybe more, I don't remember, to put into the European Constitution, or create an European Constitution that refers to Christianity, based on the faith, is the reason to be together. So I don't understand what he says. Is he saying this way? Because if I understand there are other components like justice and other, let's say, components of all of this. So is Europe a unity is united into this view? Or is it a mix of people corrupted, nations, languages, and so on? So I'm trying to see how these two things, 750 years ago, were seen and what is seen.
How they were seen by him, yes, by him. It's I'm not sure that it was so generalized, but that's an interesting question. You contrast this vision that I sketch as Dante's vision, and contrast it to the modern self-understanding of Europe. One is struck by the idea that they think that the cause of all the disagreements is exactly what Dante values the most, the Christian component. So let's really remove that. And the contradiction is self-evident, because the other continents seem to be emerging exactly with the assertion of their own religious distinctiveness. This is the way that I view contemporary European self-awareness as being deluded. They live in a world that's not the real world, and then they wake up and then they decide that they have to wage war, etc. Dante really is saying that Christianity is a distinctive trait of European history. And yet there is, which I don't want it to be neglected, because really I probably did not thematize, as we say, did not discuss it in great detail, or for a question of time. There is Rome, which has the power of uniting all the continents. The very origin of Rome, in his own mentality, in his own understanding, Aeneas is truly combines all of the 3 continents of the time. His wife, the emphasis on the 3 wives, including the story of Dido, we might say, Bacreusa, Dido, and Lavinia, is there to explain that there is a universality within the part, that above and beyond the parts, the partitions of the world, there are elements of universality. There's an element of universality, and that's Rome. That's his argument. Scandalous in terms of our own understanding? Of course. Did I write it, this thing, thinking of what's happening in Europe? Yes, exactly. There's no question that I wrote this piece thinking about what I take to be blind a blind self-definition of Europe. What is it? Is it law? Can it be the law when it's always broken? Can it be philosophy when it ends up in transgression? Can it be power, political power, when it's the cause of so many problems? So clearly, for Dante, there is such a thing as let's call it a metaphysics of justice. That's already a Christian understanding. Please.
Well, so really, we're talking about geometry as the discipline that will unite all other disciplines and all these differences in what would be love.
Yes.
Of one another. That would be the essence of
Well, Dante is a poet of love. I think that the question is the core of the question is then all of these differences, the only thing that unites all of us is really love. I think that the poem really is asking for an effort to keep all of these disciplines that seem to open up a dialogue and not break down, not allow the dialogue to break down. But of course, what he really valorizes is the world of love. Dante is a poet of love, without a doubt. The love for himself and Beatrice, as the way of God and human beings, etc. Yeah. Is it a utopian vision? It's better than nothing, than nothing that we seem to have. Thank you.
The lily and the eagle. How does that lily have to do with giving lilies with foreheads?
How had the little?
How does that lily have to do with giving lilies with foreheads?
That's it. The lily is also first of all, that's very good. This is the lily is also an emblem of death in Roman mythology. When Marcellus in the book 6 of the Aeneid, he's the young hero who dies too young, and the line that goes on, "Oh, give out lilies with full hands." So it's a part of, that's it. It's part of another transformation into the figure of the emblem, the very emblem of Roman power, Roman vision, the eagle and the eagle's eye, and a political justice, which is not really the answer. But you cannot dismiss it because it's not the full answer. It's part of this ongoing discourse. That's really if I have to, and you probably would have liked me to make one statement and 2-3 lines at the end. What is Dante really combining here and with all of these references and these details left and right? I think it's really an ongoing conversation of the arts, kind of not the belief that we can foreclose any argument, but view it as an ongoing interrogation of what those limits are and how we can go beyond the limits. That's I think what Francis was trying to tell the Sultan, and that's I really think what the marriage of faith and reason meant, because it's really represented as that kind of marriage in the canto of Dominic, in the successive canto. And the two of them together are going to be capable of doing that which no other, neither Asia nor Africa seems to be capable of understanding, reaching out to the other worlds in those terms, by following that kind of path. The radical, scandalous novelty of Francis is that he has literally, by going to the Sultan to try to convert him, to explain himself to the Sultan, has already been a triumph. Why? Because he has put an end to the Crusades. There's another way of establishing a dialogue which is not the way of violence. See what I'm saying? Yes.
I've been wanting to ask you to speak a little bit more about Francis, and maybe you can expand a little bit on that, because there's a way in which you can also read the Francis episode of going to the Sultan as not so much a reaching out and trying to cross those borders, but as a more, it's not the most common reading, but as an act seeking martyrdom, right? Because to go, right, to go and it would be blasphemous, and so it would be a provocation. So does that complicate a reading of Francis as it's going to?
I hadn't thought of his journey as a quest for the ultimate sacrifice, but it's in keeping with Francis, who appears in the canto devoted to him as a man who is capable of mocking all values and expectations of the social world, the conventions of the social world. He gives up, he marries using legal formulas, nothing, poverty. He gives up all his wealth, gets rid of his habits, which are a sign, the symbol of status, social status. He mocks even the idea of the marriage between himself and fortune is a mockery of the sexual conjunction between husband and wife, and that there is all of that. So a complete scandalous reversal of the commonly accepted values. That's it. He goes there, he's already, there is a kind of radical quality, prophetic quality to his journey. I am not coming here with arms. Here, this is what I am. The Sultan welcomes him, is not ready for the exchange. That which appears as self-humiliation of Francis is indeed the kind of triumph that Dante subscribes to. That's the argument. That's the argument. We'll see.